Well, the question was, how do I maintain the culture in my family by passing it down to my children? And that's a real important question for any group, especially groups who maintain an oral tradition. And I feel like that's part of the reason why Native Americans are so invisible, because our traditions are so ethereal. We don't have a written tradition. We know we don't have books that we pass down, our texts, our manuscripts that are like sacred to us. And so it becomes almost an invisible part of the world. And I've asked myself that same question. And I think as I was a teenager, I really wanted to understand how I was different from white people. You know, I mean, I wanted to know what made me a Native American, besides, you know, my blood quantum or whatever, and my behavior. And so I learned how to sing. You know, I became more involved in my culture. I participated in ceremonies, fasting, sweat lodge, everything, you know, and trying to understand what it means really to be an Indian, a Native American. And all those things were good, you know, and they're all important, and I participated in all of them, but I don't know if they've ever really, you know, satiated that uh, desire to know that question or to answer it. And what I keep coming back to is, you know, the values. Um, you know, they're the values that you have, that you use every day. You know, the way you treat your children and the way you treat yourself, and you know the way you treat your surroundings, and all those things express your values. And so, you know, a lot of our culture was stripped away from us by boarding schools, when our grandparents and great grandparents were shipped away, not allowed to speak their language. And so a lot of Native Americans, because the oral tradition is so dependent upon our language and being together as a group, we've experienced that trauma of that loss. And I feel like even though there's been a lot that has been lost, uh, those values that come from my great grandmother, on both sides, they still run true today, because that's how my mother raised me. And you know, she was raised by her mother with those same values. And so I don't really ask my kids to believe in anything. You know, I mean, as a child, I was never asked to believe in anything. That's not the way we do things in Indian country typically. You know, we uh, show our kids we love them and we're supporting them, and we want them to find their own way. You know, we want them to find out what's real, and when they want to know what's something, they'll ask us a question. You know, and when my kids ask me questions about life and the world, I try to give them an honest answer that reflects the values of me as a Crow Indian. There hasn't been much DNA research in Native American communities at all. And I kind of feel like, uh, you know, there are good reasons why there hasn't been research, but at the same time, it's not really benefiting Native people. I'm an advocate for that research. I think we need to do it. I think, you know, it's inevitable that we will do it at some point. It's going to benefit us. It's going to benefit society. But we have to do it in the way that we feel is respectful, that we feel is going to have integrity with our values. And I think that's the challenge. And, you know, there are groups in Native America throughout the nation who are open and interested in doing DNA research, but there are very few. And I think the key is to have people in leadership positions at the university, at the tribal colleges, at the tribal councils, and in the tribal executive administrations, as well as community support. If you don't have all five of those things, and to have a good research team that you want to work with, that you trust, and to have the funding to move forward and the infrastructure, there's a lot of boxes that need to be checked before DNA research moves forward in Indian country the way we want to see it move forward, which is it's going to benefit everybody. It's going to bring jobs, right? It's going to bring sacred knowledge. It's going to connect people in ways that they've never been connected before. It's going to give us insight into how we are related to each other, and a lot of other things that we don't even know yet. And so I'm hopeful. Right now I'm working with a team on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation here in Montana, and we're confident that we're going to get a study going with the University of Copenhagen, Denmark, the same team that studied the Anzick Boy. And we want to do a study on the Blackfeet Nation. It will be a long-term study that will focus on disease prevention, such as diabetes. And within the context of that, there's going to be a lot of other important and useful information, hopefully, that we'll glean from that. Well, I think there's several good reasons why Native communities are resistant to DNA research, first of all. One of them primarily is that they feel like it is invasive. Anytime you do DNA research, you have to take tissue samples from people. And depending on how deep a study you want to do, it could either be blood or it could be something simple like a cotton swab. But either way, you're making yourself vulnerable, putting forward that tissue. And I feel like, well, working with Native communities on this and talking to Native people about it, they don't see the cost-benefit reward that is going to, make them feel comfortable with doing that. They just don't see how, a violation of their privacy, giving away, their own body samples to people to study, is really worth it to them. And so they're trying to understand why they would want to do that. So that's one big thing. And on top of that, you have this experience with non-Indian researchers over history where Native people have been kind of used and disrespected from a research paradigm perspective. And so they're often treated as subjects in a study rather than as partners and as members of the team who are uncovering together a shared history or knowledge base. And so there's that aspect as well. They don't trust researchers because of the history that's there. And then there's also skepticism about the use of people who are deceased. So using dead people to compare DNA over time is another issue that is problematic because a lot of folks in Indian country feel like just because someone is dead, that doesn't mean that they should be disrespected, and they feel like taking information or bones or samples is a disrespectful thing to do. And so those are some of the bigger reasons why Native communities haven't really warmed up, I guess you could say, to DNA research. Great story. It's a star story, and that's one of the stories that kind of ties all of the groups from the Northern Plains and even in that region around the plateau area of the Yellowstone Park, ties them all together. Because all those groups, even though they came from different linguistic backgrounds, shared the story of the Red Woman. And the Red Woman is connected to the story of the twins. And the twins actually, they're well known, of course, in Northern Plains cosmology and how they're associated with different constellations in the Red Woman. But they're also well known in the South and Southwest. And so the twins are kind of a well-known star story. But here on the Northern Plains, the story of the Red Woman is that she killed the twins' mother while the twins were still in utero. I mean, they had not been born yet. And the Red Woman was never really defined. I don't think it's ever really been defined in Crow culture exactly what she was. She was some type of a monster. She wasn't really a human. And she had, supernatural powers. And so she came to the home of the twins' mother while the father was out hunting. And she portrayed herself as a friendly visitor. And then the mother, who was pregnant, of course, with twins, fed the woman and welcomed her. In the Crow tradition, you always welcome guests to your home. And then in the process of that, the woman took advantage of her and killed her. And it's a horrific story. She cut her open and she took the two babies and threw them. And so she threw one of them in the water, and she threw one of them behind the liner between the teepee, the outside of the teepee, and the inside. There's a liner that they put around to kind of insulate it. And then when the father came back, found his wife dead, found the one behind the liner. And so his name is behind the liner, thrown behind the liner. And so years go by, and then father never knew about the other twin, because the other twin was in a spring, and they called him thrown in the spring. And he became like a water monster. He preferred to live in the water. And so he didn't want to come around his dad. When his dad would leave, he would play with his brother. And then one day, finally, the dad figured out what was going on. And so they devised a plan, and they built a sweat lodge. It's like a steam room with hot rocks. And they fooled the boy, basically. And they took him in there, and they poured hot water on the rocks, and the steam came, and they prayed, and it got real hot. And they say when it gets real hot like that, you remember who you are. And so that boy remembered he was a human being. And then after that, he lived with his brother and his dad, and they were superheroes. They had superpowers, and I've thought a lot about why they had the powers, but I keep coming back to this idea: the more trauma that you've experienced, or the more horrific event that you've survived through, the greater powers you're going to be able to draw upon. And so these kids, there was nothing they couldn't do. And the first thing they wanted to do was go after the woman who killed their mother. And so they went after the Red Woman, and there's different stories about how they got her. One of them is when she finally figured out that they were trailing her and they were going to get her, she tried to run away. And so she started climbing up into the sky, and she put her hand up there, and they came and got her and started cutting her up. And they cut her hand off while she was reaching in the sky, and that's the constellation that we see as Orion's belt. And there's 4 stars, and then if you kind of go off from I guess it's the north one, there's a couple more little stars that look like a big hand. And so that's Red Woman's hand. And then she had a few things with her, and one of them was her digging stick, because everyone out here on the Northern Plains had a digging stick, because wild plants were part of the diet. And digging up the plants, you had to have a little stick. And so they took her stick, and they threw it, and all her stuff, they threw her body all around, and the stick landed there at the Mammoth Hot Springs. And so the different tribes know that stick as Red Woman's digging stick, but it's a like you were saying, a calcium build up by the hot springs there, and now it's called the Liberty Cap. There's a little sign there that says Liberty Cap at the Yellowstone Park at Mammoth. But actually, that's the Red Woman's digging stick. And that story ties together all these tribes. And I think one of the things that I had a kind of an aha moment thinking about it, teaching Native American studies here in Montana, how could they all have that same exact story if they all came from different areas and they all had different languages and they all did everything different? And they did. But how could they have still had that same story down to every detail? I mean, the names of the boys, everything. I mean, and it's a long story. I gave you a really short version, right? But and then it occurred to me, well, these people were in close contact with each other over generations, and the sign language that they developed was just another indication of how closely linked they were, despite their seemingly insurmountable differences. And to me, that's a hopeful message to people, and to Native people especially, because we've been led to believe that we always fought each other, and we were constantly at war. And in fact, a lot of historians like to point to that when they talk about how the military came in here and brutalized Native people, and said, well, it wasn't any worse than what they were doing to each other. I mean, that's the kind of the excuse that's thrown out there. But and I understand that whole perspective, but at the same time, there's a much deeper reality that sometimes we're just not aware of, that it's beneath the surface. Teepee rings are real key here. I think archaeologists have estimated that there are over 1 million teepee rings on the northern plains. And so these are rock circles, and they're easily identifiable here on the northern plains at certain times of the year. And historically speaking, before you had plows come in and plow up wheat for wheat, or before you had cows come in and graze and kick the rocks around, and before the land was disturbed, you would find these teepee rings especially at certain sites that are perfect for camping. And the site that you're referring to there is kind of up on a flat plain just before you enter into the Yellowstone Park, really. And it's at a real nice area above the water. And so what you can assume is that if you're there for any amount of time, there's going to be animals that come to graze there and drink water. And that's going to be an opportunity for you as a hunter-gatherer to harvest those animals. It's also just a nice spot to be located because of the view. And I mean, these people like the same things that people all around the world do, right? A great view. What's better than opening up your computer and seeing that screensaver shot? That's not just something that came about, in the 21st century. That's ancient. You want to see something, right? You want to see beautiful spots. And so a lot of the places where you see teepee rings are located in areas where you have beautiful views. And they're not only beautiful, but they're also views that are advantageous for you as an individual who's living off the fat of the land, per se. And so those teepee rings that you see outside of the Yellowstone Park there are located in an area, again, you have the river down below, the Gardner River on one side, and then on the other side, you have the Yellowstone River. And so those two rivers together, coming from different areas in the park, are both long-time game trails. So you are at a prime spot now for either spot, whether you have deer, elk, or bison migrating from either one of those valleys there, they're going to cross through that area. And the way the wind blows there typically blows from the south to the north. At different times of the year, it'll blow north. But just because of the way that the area is there, the wind kind of swirls around and comes northward, and that causes the bison to walk towards that area, because the bison always walk into the wind. I think it's the young people. I think uh, they're the future. They're bright and talented. They have energy. They have perspective. Um, they've got a unique place that they're sitting at, culturally speaking. Um, and at the same time, they're faced with great challenges. Um, for sure, one of the biggest challenges right now at the moment facing the Crow tribe is the coronavirus. Um, the tribe is on a lockdown right now. Crow Fair has been canceled. There's been no events all summer. We just had two more tribal members die just 2 days ago. And so we're up to 15 tribal members now have died from the virus. And we have like over 200 active cases in the community. So, that's of immediate importance right now, trying to stop the spread and get healthy. And in terms of the long-term outlook for the young people, anytime you come from a rural area, it's going to be hard to stay there because of the lack of job opportunities. And I guess that's the challenge that Native people face, is that so much of their culture is connected to those communities, but it's such a challenge to stay in those communities because of the lack of opportunities. And I kind of feel like I'm an example of that. I work with my community. Luckily, in the day and age we live in, I don't have to be there all the time. And I really think that that's a hopeful thing, that young people can continue to be members of their nation, not necessarily being on the ground there every day, but they can continue to do work from afar that helps benefit the community. I've always believed that the Crow people have so much to share with the world. We have our art, we have our philosophy, we have our landscape, we have our spiritual values, we have our way of thinking about family and how it connects to everything in the world. And I just feel like we haven't really taken full opportunity and advantage of that, as far as making the most of it for our own resources. We've been dealing with poverty for a long time, and I think that struggle continues. But again, I think we're more innovative now than we've ever been before. There's a greater interest now than ever before in Native people and Native communities. There's more money in Montana in terms of folks who are interested in Native people and willing to contribute something to the communities. And so and that's part of the reason why I work with the group in Crow on tourism. And we've never really done much tourism right up until about 5 or 10 years ago, and now we're really getting into it. And it's taken a while to come together, but we've got a pretty good team. I'm a member of the team here in Bozeman, but we have members, of course, on the reservation and elsewhere off the reservation in Billings. And we all work together to bring people to Crow Country, to show them the beauty of our land, of our culture, and to help them contribute to our overall well-being. So I think we have a lot of good things to look forward to. We just need to find a way to stay positive, stay upbeat, direct our work in a good way. And for that, we know we need leadership to help us focus those efforts. And so I'm hopeful that, we have an election season coming up here. Our election cycle in Crow is the same as the national cycle. And we have an opportunity to bring some fresh leadership in. And, I'm always hopeful that we can do things better. I just wrote a lesson this past spring for Montana OPI on the pandemic that occurred here in Montana with Northern Plains people, Plains Indians, with smallpox, diphtheria, typhoid, typhus. Those were some of the diseases that were brought here by non-Indian traders. Some people believe that intentionally that they were brought here. Others are not so sure about it. I think that there probably is a mixture of those. Some of it was unintentional. Some of it may have been intentional. Any way you look at it, the Plains Indians were absolutely devastated by smallpox and the diseases brought here by Europeans. All the statistics you look at talk about anywhere between 75 to 90% of attrition rate. So especially over in the upper Missouri River there, the Crow Indians trading partners, the Mandan and Hidatsa and Arikara, they all lived in earth lodges. And they're like one of the very few groups on the plains that had year-round habitation sites. Once you get over to Montana, and I wanted to follow this up on the Teepee Rings issue as well, once you get over here to Montana, you find that people moved their homes all throughout the year. And that's why you find the Teepee Rings, they could be different areas because people were moving around from winter camps to summer camps. And so, you know, when the virus hit here, amongst people who are more mobile, they were able to survive it much better than the groups who lived in just the year-round habitation sites. And it's very fascinating when you reflect back, you look at what the fur trappers and traders and even what the Crow Indians said. When the smallpox hit them, they split up into small groups and they totally social distanced. And I just thought, wow, you know, they knew exactly what was going on. You know, as soon as they realized that disease had come, they said, we're not going to see you until next year. And they all split off into small groups, and that's how they survived it. And, you know, there's a really tragic story about this place in Billings over there along the Yellowstone River. They call it Sacrifice Cliff. And I included that story in that lesson plan. I don't know if you're familiar with that story. But this was there was 3 major smallpox outbreaks. First one was in the 1780s. There was another one in the 1820s, and then there was a third one in the 1830s. And I believe that the Sacrifice Cliff one comes from the 1830s, that last big epidemic. And these guys, the story of this Crow village that was camped over around Billings, up above the rims, and it was summertime, and you know, the men had left. They were out hunting and gathering or whatever. When they came home, they found their wives, their children, their parents, everyone was dead. There was just very few people who were still alive with the virus, you know, on death's door. And so when they came in and they, you know, became exposed to it and saw the people that were dying from it, they understood that they were going to die too. They just knew, you know. And so in their devastation, you know, in their just complete, you know, sadness and depression, they both decided they were going to sacrifice themselves so that they wouldn't infect anybody else, you know, and that they had lost all their family and they just wanted to go be with them anyway. And so they blindfolded their horses, and then they, you know, they painted themselves, and they took their horses up on the cliff there behind them, what today they call Metro Park, and they went over. They killed themselves on their horses, and that story lives on. And in fact, if you go to Billings today, there's a plaque there, Sacrifice Cliff. And, you know, it's still talked about today after all these years. And again, I think the thing that's most fascinating to me is that they had such a thorough understanding of, you know, how germs were passed. And that's reflected in all the things that they did. You know, I mean, they were very conscientious about their tidiness and their cleanliness on every little thing that they did. And I noticed that about the older people who I kind of grew up around, my grandmother and my grandfather. Every little thing, you know, as soon as they wake up in the morning, the first thing they do is make their bed, you know, and then start preparing, right? Clean themselves. You know, wash your hair, wash your face, put clean clothes on, you know, take care of your space. And I think that they developed those values in that culture all those hundreds, thousands of years because they never had to take care of anything else except themselves. You know, in Europe and in other parts of the world, people were always taking care of animals, you know, as a way of, uh, you know, surviving. Uh, whether you're a cattle rancher, sheep, you know, whatever, pigs, cows, or goats, there was that association. And I think that, you know, it had a way of kind of, I don't know, influencing all these different other factors with your daily life. And for Native people, that tradition of like taking care of yourself each day, making sure you were cleaned out every day, um, that was part of what kept them healthy. And because of that, I think that they had, you know, very low immunity to any kind of retrograde viruses, because they just weren't exposed to those things. They didn't have any contact with them. And even the way they, you know, their most sacred ceremonies were all cleansing. You know, the sweat lodge ceremony, where you go in there, you wash off your body, you get all the sweat out, and then you drink fresh water, and then you dip yourself in the cold water there. You know, and I was always told that's what Native people always did first thing in the morning. You know, get in that cold water and wash yourself. And that, as it turns out now, the scientists are telling us, oh, well, that cold response, that physical response that your body has to the cold water, that ups your, you know, white blood cell count. You know, it cleans out your blood. And so I think they had a lot of traditions that, you know, science is just now discovering. Even something simple like the smudge, you know, where they always burned cedar and burned sweetgrass and bear root, like either in the sweat lodge or in their teepees or at a ceremony. Now science is discovering, you know, and they would put the smoke on their head and everything. They're finding out that if they take, you know, a bear root or whatever, sage, put it in a room and burn it, shut the door and come back a couple days later, no bacteria in there, no viruses or anything that's left alive from that cleansing of that smoke. And so, you know, I think they had a lot of good things going for them. And it's a shame that, you know, we haven't ever really learned that much from them. And I'm talking about our nation as a whole. And we don't really appreciate all these amazing gifts that they've left to us, you know. And where you see it, I think I guess the most ancient history that we have on it is the parfleshes that they used to make out of the rawhide. So they would make rawhide parfleshes made out of, you know, rawhide. They would cleanse it first, and then when it dried, it was hard like plastic, and they would paint those hourglass shapes on there. And the hourglass is a lot like, it's kind of like a metaphor. It's a geometrical, I guess, partner to the circle, you know, because it's balanced and it's, you know, symmetrical on either side, and that you can use it to divide things. And there's something very elegant and very just pretty about it. And I've looked a lot at, you know, Orion. And you know, there's those four big stars, and then in between those four, you have the three little ones. And I've thought about how those four are kind of a perfect, you know, setup for hourglass. Even the three little stars, if you just follow that line up, and then one on the other side, now you've got your hourglass. And I've asked people about that, and some historians, no one's ever really said, "Oh yeah, that's right, Shane." You know, some of them have said, "Oh yeah, you know, I guess that's kind of true." But the one other thing I've heard is that when I asked another historian, they said, "Oh no, that comes from the horned toad. If you look at the back of a horned toad, there's an hourglass shape, and that they took that, you know, design from the back of that horned toad." And I know they used horned toads a lot. They were kind of an important animal. Um, just for what they could offer people. And so I think there's a couple different schools of thought of where that hourglass comes from, but for sure it makes most sense to see it on a parfleche, you know, kind of a rectangular thing. And then when the beads came along, uh, you know, they started beating those hourglass shapes, and then they started beating them onto buckskin. And so it wasn't just rawhide anymore. It was a whole another material that they were using for the for those hourglasses. Now you see the hourglasses uh, in earrings a lot, and they'll either be rectangular earrings or they'll be circular earrings, and they'll have the hourglass between in the circle, kind of dissecting the circle. But I would add that it's the Crow Indians who are so into the hourglass, and you don't see that so much with all the other tribes. I mean, there you see some Cheyennes use hourglass a little bit, but for sure it's definitely a Crow thing. And then the other thing I would add to that is that typically when you see the hourglass design with the Crow culture, the two most prominent colors that are always used with the beads there or the paints are baby blue and pink. And you know, I always wondered, you know, as a kid, I wonder why, you know, all the Crow Indians use pink and light blue, powder blue and light pink on everything. And then found out later, you know, studying the topic, asking people, oh, that comes from the sunrise and the sunset. You know, especially when it gets really cold here in Montana, like really cold in the winter. If it's a clear morning and the sun comes up, man, it will just be light pink and powder blue right across the sky. And, you know, for them, that was like their most sacred time of the day, right? That's when they would really offer their prayers. And so that hourglass and those colors, they all, I feel like they come from the sky, and they're connected to, you know, their understanding of the cosmology of the universe. Yeah, what an amazing story. You know, that was a total accident. And the way it happened was the landowners had given permission for some construction workers to gather some loose rock out of this cliff face on his property. And so there's a small creek that runs at the bottom of his property, and there's a high hill that it runs just underneath. And on the lower part of the high hill, there's a lot of rock, like kind of outcropping of rock. And so I believe they were going to be building a little stone wall at the Livingston High School, which is a high school located about, you know, 30 miles from the Anzick site. And so the construction workers were there, and the way I was told was they backed their pickup up to the cliff face, and you know, they just lowered the tailgate, and it made it real easy. And one guy got up and kind of with a shovel kind of loosened the rock and kind of scraped him right down onto the bed of the truck, right? And you know, just the most easy way you would think of to do something like that. And once they had loaded up enough, uh, the guy at the back told the driver, "Go ahead, and you know, this is enough for now." And the driver says as he drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror and he saw something drop from that hole that they had just dug into the cliff. So he stopped his truck, he got out, he went back over into the cliff, and he started looking up at the hole they had just dug. And here were all of these points. And so he pulled another one out, and then all of a sudden the other ones kind of started to come along with them. And then they realized that, you know, from looking at things, that they had come across a major deposit of something. And this was 1968, the summer of 1968, like the September or August. And so they immediately said, let's go home and we'll come back tomorrow and load all this stuff up, or we'll come back tonight and load all this stuff up. So they went home, had dinner, whatever, got their wives, And so their wives helped them, and then they came back and they took all the artifacts out of there and they loaded them up into these drywall buckets. And a drywall bucket is a big white plastic bucket. It's about 2 feet tall and probably about 10 inches in diameter or so, maybe a foot in diameter. And they loaded 10 of them, 10 drywall buckets full of the materials from that little boy's grave, all priceless Clovis artifacts. And so then they went home, they took all the artifacts home, and they washed all the red ochre off of them. And they kind of complained about how much red ochre was all over them, and they said they had red ochre all over themselves. And, this sacred powder that was provided into this grave, and they just thought it was just old dust, and washed it all off. And then, after all that, called the archaeologist and said, oh yeah, we found a whole bunch of stuff over there and we took it all out. It's sitting around here. So the archaeologist went back. He tried to do an assessment of the site, and immediately realized that it was not going to be possible because they had done too much damage to it. They had not only had they taken all the stuff out, but then they reloaded the hole back with the dirt again or whatever. And so any idea of how to properly date things and all that was out the window. And that's part of the reason. I'm glad you brought that question up, because that's the main reason why this site is not worldwide. No, I mean, it's not world famous. Because when the official archaeologists came here from Texas, and somebody came from California, I think, and they came to the site and they just said, you guys ruined it. I mean, you got the artifacts out, but you ruined the site. There's nothing we can say really about the site other than what we can glean from the artifacts. And so, for better or worse, the Anzick site was really kind of forgotten about, and no one really knew about it until the DNA study was done. But even notwithstanding that, the tools, the 118 priceless Clovis tools that came out of that boy's grave, are still privately held. And at the time, now they're on display at the Montana Historical Society. But those in and of themselves should have been enough to make the site world famous. But it was just to spoil how the site was spoiled that just really was harmful to everyone and everything associated with it.
Hey,